Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Dennis Cassidy, and with me is Kevin Sisney. We represent the sales team here at Ridge Security for North America. I am the sales director. Kevin Sisney is the director of sales engineering. So today we're here to discuss what we believe is the most critical shift security leaders need to make in 2026, the move from visibility to validation. If you've been in cybersecurity for any length of time, you've heard the mantra, you can't protect what you can't see, and that is true. Visibility has been the foundation of our security programs for years, but the reality we're all facing in 2026, visibility alone is no longer enough to protect your organization. So today we're going to walk through why this shift is happening now, what continuous validation actually means in practice, and most importantly, how you can implement this in your organization this year. So we'll be sharing some concrete examples, real world use cases with RidgeBot, and a practical roadmap you can take back to your team. We encourage you to leave any comments or questions in the chat or the Q&A section throughout the presentation, and we'll do our best to answer as they come in. So let's dive in. So the problem statement here is visibility alone fails. We look at where we are today. Most security programs are built on vulnerability scanning and annual penetration tests. You know, you could run Qualys, Nessus, Tenable. They all give us massive lists of CVEs. They check a compliance box, but here's what keeps me up at night, and I suspect many of you are feeling the same way. Kevin, did you want to weigh in on some of these points here on this slide?
Right, exactly. So, scanners find vulnerabilities, but can you actually exploit them? I can apply metrics to that to see if they're exploitable, what the percentage of them being exploitable is. That's the million-dollar question. Your scanner might flag 5,000 vulnerabilities, but how many are actually exploitable? And does the team need to do all of that work if only 10 of them are exploitable? How many are actually exploitable in your specific environment, your configuration? Most scanners can tell you that they found a CVE, not whether an attacker can weaponize it against you. So, and with logic flaws and attack chains, known CVEs miss logic flaws, chained attacks and configuration gaps. This is critical. Some of the most devastating breaches we've seen, SolarWinds, Microsoft Exchange, cloud misconfigurations weren't about a single CVE. They were about chained vulnerabilities, logic flaws in how systems interact, or misconfigurations the scanners simply don't detect. And together, you've got administrative access after these chained attacks to your entire AWS environment. The defense question, reports don't answer, will this actually stop an attacker? This is what your board is asking. This is what your CEO wants to know. Not just did we scan it or did we find issues, but are we actually protected? If somebody targets us tomorrow, will our controls work? Traditional reports don't answer that question. And then we've got the annual gap. Pen tests leave in an 9 to 11 month gap if you retest after 90 days. So you get your report, you remediate the findings. Then what about the other 9 to 11 months? What about an S3 bucket that just got stood up in June? The new identity provider you integrated in September. None of these get tested until the next January or the next annual pen test. It's just too big of a blind spot in today's landscape.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kevin. So as we transition into 2026, this is a reality check. We're looking at threat speed. Attack surfaces are expanding faster than any annual point-in-time audits can track. There is increased board pressure, and AI agents are everywhere, both on the offensive security side, the defensive security side, and in the hands of adversaries. Kevin, I don't know if you wanted to comment further on some of these points here.
Right. Looking at threat speed, attack surfaces expanding, quicker than our annual audits or even biannual pen testing can look at. Consider your environment right now. How many new services, APIs, cloud resources, containers, microservices get deployed every week? If you're in a modern DevSecOps or DevOps environment, it's dozens or hundreds. Your infrastructure is changing faster than you can manually track it. And attackers know this. They know, and they're not waiting for your annual audit cycle. They're looking for that new API endpoint that went live Tuesday. And according to recent data, the average enterprise deploys new infrastructure changes every 3 to 5 days. By the time your annual pen test or biannual pen test rolls around, you may be dealing with 70 plus new attack surfaces that weren't even in scope. We see board pressure. Boards demand quantified risks, not checkbox compliance or checkbox security. This hits home for every CISO on this call. Your board isn't satisfied with, we passed our SOC 2 audit or we're PCI compliant. How many of the breaches in the last, just say 2 years of the Fortune 500 were not PCI compliant or SOC 2 compliant? Those are checkboxes. That's not security. What's our blast radius? What's our actual cyber risk exposure in dollars? If we're breached tomorrow, what does that look like? These are all business risk questions that require validation, not visualization, and not just compliance check marks. SEC disclosure rules, cyber insurance requirements, shareholder pressure are all driving this shift. Your board wants proof of resilience, not just effort. AI agents, new identities, APIs, attack paths appear daily. And this is the wild card really for this year. AI agents are exploding across the enterprises. Your sales team uses AI SDRs or BDRs. Your customer service uses AI chatbots. Your development team uses AI coding assistants. Each is a new identity with access, a new API endpoint, a new integration point. They're being deployed outside traditional IT and security and governance. And as a result, outside of the security visibility, we're seeing organizations going from managing a few hundred identities to suddenly managing thousands of AI agents and their identities, each with its own permissions, API keys, and data access patterns. So, how do we address this? And that's where our shift is coming.
Thank you, Kevin. To that point, the shift, it's from visibility to validation. So traditionally, we know what exists. We know what vulnerabilities exist. There's been point-in-time exercises, compliance checkbox. But moving into this new era, we're at a point where we need to prove that controls work, test exploitability, have a more continuous approach, and have evidence of resilience. Kevin, I don't know if you wanted to comment further on this here slide.
This is where we're at today. We know what exists. You have an asset inventory. You know what's in your environment. That's table stakes. We have a list of vulnerabilities. Your scanners produce reports, thousands of findings, but it's not listing prioritization of risk. Point-in-time testing. Annual pen tests give you a snapshot, but a snapshot from January through March doesn't reflect the rest of the year. Compliance checkboxes. You can say yes to an audit question, but compliance does not equal security. We see it every day. This is visibility. It's necessary. You need to know what you have, but it's not sufficient to defend against today's threats. In the right column, we've got validation. Let's contrast this. This proves your controls work. Can you demonstrate that your WAF blocks SQL injection? Does your EDR detect lateral movement? Can your MFA be bypassed? Validation means proving it. Test exploitability, not just CVE. Does this CVE exist? We tested it, and yes, an attacker can exploit this in our environment with our specific configurations. That's exploitability testing. Continuous assessment. This isn't annual, it's ongoing. It's every other week, every month, every quarter. As your infrastructure changes, validation happens automatically. A new API was deployed on Friday, it's tested on Monday. Resilience evidence. You can walk into a board meeting and say, here's evidence we can withstand these attack scenarios. Here are our defense depth metrics. Here's proof our controls work under attack simulation. Think of it this way. Visibility tells you what you have. Validation tells you what actually works. In 2026, boards, auditors, insurance companies, more importantly, want to know what works, not what your tick boxes are. What does an automated scanning tool do, and how does it help us with validation?
Right, and I think that's a good segue to this slide here. Automated scanning, the more traditional approach. Tool-driven automated scanners have been out for decades now. With that comes a lot of false positives and false negatives, lacks context on where the real exploitable risk is, and also doesn't show what a kill chain realistically could look like. So moving forward, continuous validation with tools like RidgeBot is something that will keep up with the trends that we're seeing going forward. And Kevin, I'm sure you have a few comments based on your viewpoint.
Absolutely. So I used to run vulnerability and risk management programs in fintech and other industries. And I would, find tens of thousands of vulnerabilities. We run a script, you tick a box, CVE is present, it's vulnerable. We get a lot of false positives. Most of that data is probably false positive or, something that we don't need to pay attention to today. It's not an exploit. It's not exploitable. Lacks context and real risk. A scanner might flag 50 high severities. Which five matter to the business? Which two are exploitable? Which can cause me harm? Take over my SQL databases, ransomware, TTPs, things to that nature. Missed chained attacks. This is huge. This is where RidgeBot really shines. Real attackers chain multiple vulnerabilities together. They exploit low severity flaw to gain a foothold, escalate privileges via a misconfiguration, pivot laterally through a forgotten service account, then exfiltrate data. Scanners report 3 separate low or medium findings. They don't see the critical attack flow. Now, with validation, we've got AI plus human expertise. RidgeBot combines automated exploitation with AI-driven analysis and human pen tester validation. It doesn't just scan. It thinks like an attacker, and when it identifies something significant, our team validates it. Verified exploitation. We don't just report that a vulnerability exists. We prove it's exploitable by generating proof of concept exploits. You get screenshots, attack paths, step-by-step reproduction. No more debating with DevOps whether something is really a risk or not. Is it exploitable? You have proof of it. Business-aligned prioritization. So, we map findings to your critical assets, your crown jewels, and your business impact. If a vulnerability could affect your critical customer database, it's prioritized. If it's on an isolated dev server, it's appropriately contextualized. Complete attack path. We test lateral movement, privilege escalation chains, post-compromise activity, and that's what real attackers do, and that's how we provide you that risk context in the environment. Scanning tells you vulnerabilities exist. Validation proves attackers can exploit them and shows you how.
Absolutely. So I know you'll be getting into a demo a little bit later in the presentation here, Kevin, but first we just want to illustrate what RidgeBot does, validation at scale. So the first thing it'll do is iteratively figure out what your asset profiles look like, fingerprint all of your assets, try to exploit vulnerabilities, and then move laterally. And RidgeBot doesn't just do this in one period of time. It iteratively launches thousands and thousands of jobs for each of the tests that it does. And I know, Kevin, you probably have a few comments.
I'll walk through these. So with smart fingerprinting, we understand the actual attack surface. RidgeBot doesn't just port scan and call it a day. We're going to intelligently fingerprint your environment, identifying what technologies you're running, how they're configured, their versions, and existing integrations. It maps your actual attack surface, including shadow IT, forgotten APIs, cloud resources that might not be in your CMDB. And this is really critical, is knowing what's really out there. You can't validate what you don't understand. We've seen customers discover 30, 40% more attack surface than they expected through shadow IT, APIs, old cloud instances, and forgotten dev environments. With auto exploitation, we're going to test real exploitability, not just a CVE existence. This is where Ridgebot goes beyond scanning. When it identifies a potential vulnerability, it attempts to exploit it safely and in a controlled manner. If it succeeds, you get proof with detailed evidence. If it fails, maybe because your compensating controls worked, that's valuable too, because you're going to see that your controls worked. You learn the defenses are holding. We're not just checking whether CVE-2024 XXX is present. We're testing whether an attacker can actually exploit it in your specific environment. With lateral movement, we map post-breach impact and defense depth. This is where we go beyond perimeter testing. Ridgebot simulates what happens after an attacker breaches the perimeter. Can they move laterally? Can they escalate privileges? Can they reach your crown jewels, your database, your customer data, intellectual property? This provides you with defense depth metrics. You can say, even if an attacker breaches our perimeter, they need to overcome 4 additional control layers to reach sensitive data. That's evidence of resilience, not visualization. What this means in practice, you get automated pen testing that runs continuously, adapts to your changing attack surface and environment, and provides you with board-ready validation evidence. And I'll hand it back over to Dennis. What sets Ridgebot apart?
Yep. So some key differentiators for Ridgebot: adversary emulation, simulates real attacker behavior and kill chains. It can operate autonomously and continuously. And what we're looking at is risk-based prioritization. Kevin, I know you probably have a few comments to describe this a bit further.
Right. With adversary emulation, we're simulating real attack behavior. We're not running vulnerability checks. We're emulating adversary tactics, techniques, and procedures. MITRE attack aligned. We think like threat actors, reconnaissance, initial access, privilege escalation, lateral movement, and exfiltration. This gives you real-world attack scenarios, not just vulnerability lists. We threat intelligence on how ransomware groups operate, how APT actors move laterally, how insider threats abuse legitimate tools. Continuous operation validates continuously, not annually. I just can't really stress this enough. Ridgebot can run 24/7. As your infrastructure changes, we're testing it. New deployment, we validate it. Configuration changes, we test it. This eliminates the 9 to 11 month blind spots we discussed earlier. Some customers run Ridgebot weekly, while other customers run it daily. We've had customers in highly dynamic environments that run continuous validation in near real time. With risk-based scoring, we prioritize by actual risk, business impact. This is where we integrate asset criticality and business context. Not all assets are equal. Your production customer database isn't the same as a dev server. Ridgebot understands this and scores findings by business impact and exposure scoring, not just CVSS scoring. You can filter and prioritize based on what matters to your business: public facing versus internal, critical versus non-critical. Other platforms focus on vulnerability aggregation, aggregating scan data from multiple tools and correlating it. Ridgebot goes further. We evaluate through active exploitation testing. We prove what's exploitable, and we show you the attack path. Validation isn't just about identifying vulnerabilities. It's about testing your defenses across 3 critical dimensions.
Absolutely. And on that topic, there's 3 dimensions of validation. detection validation. Can we actually see the attacks? Prevention validation. Do the controls block the attacks? And response validation. Can you respond fast enough? Kevin, I know you probably have a few more comments on these
Yeah,
on these
sure.
three topics. Yep.
With detection validation, do your sensors see the attacks? This tests your visibility layer. When RidgeBot simulates an attack like a SQL injection or lateral movement, does your SIM, your EDR, your IDS, your IPS firewall detect it? Does the attack occur in a blind spot in your network that you weren't aware of? We've had customers discover their expensive security tools that we all own and have weren't detecting obvious attack behaviors. It's a wake-up call. If RidgeBot can do it undetected, so can real attackers. With prevention validation, do your controls block attacks? This tests your prevention layer. Does your WAF block exploits? Does your network segmentation prevent lateral movement? Does your EDR stop malicious processes? The key word here is actually. Many organizations assume their controls work because they're deployed and configured. Validation shows you whether they work under real-world attack conditions. With response validation, can you respond fast enough? This tests your response capability. When RidgeBot triggers a detection, how long does it take the SOC to investigate, to notice, to flag, to ask questions, to contain it? We can measure your mean time to detect and mean time to respond using real data, not hypothetical tabletop exercises or pristine images in a lab. Now, one of the other bigger problems is CISOs face is that annual pen testing trap. Dennis?
Yep, and this is near and dear to my heart. I've worked at a number of different organizations and have offered, the annual traditional pen testing approach. And Kevin, I know you've been on the buyer side as a practitioner.
Yep.
And it's really comes down to it's a point in time exercise. What about the rest of those 11 months? It's super valuable to have that annual pen test done, but as we all know, infrastructure, applications, APIs, they all change on a weekly or daily basis for a lot of modern organizations. So I don't know if you wanted to weigh in on that further, Kevin.
Yeah, absolutely. When I ran vulnerability and risk management in fintech, and we were on that tick the box, have name the auditor come in and test the environment, and we would retest, rush to fix everything, and then retest, and then do our weekly or monthly patching cadence. Your environment constantly changes. It's not about patching vulnerabilities. It's about the web dev or the web team stood up 2 new websites with 6 new identities, 10 new of this. Your environment constantly changes, and you need to be looking for those potential new attack vectors, and if we don't test them again for another 6 to 9 months, we're not going to know about them. We can't rely on the development department to tell security, hey, by the way, we're doing this. The sales department to go, hey, we're standing up 10 new AI SDR agents, things to that nature. New infrastructure, API, cloud resources. Most of the breaches lately have been misconfigurations or human error. And that doesn't get caught in that pen test cycle. And attackers know this. They know organizations test annually or biannually. They know the best times to target you isn't right after your pen test. When you're freshly remediated, it's 6 to 9 months down the line when you've accumulated all of this new exposure. And this is why cyber insurance is getting way more expensive, why insurers are asking harder questions. Insurers are starting to ask, when was your last validation? What's your continuous testing cadence? Annual isn't cutting it anymore. And insurance underwriters and board of directors are starting to see that and enforce that. So, what's the alternative? Continuous validation. Let's look at that.
Yep, it's machine speed, continuous validation with a combination of both speed and coverage. And a solution like RidgeBot is well suited to keep up with this shift that's happening.
Yeah. So, we're looking at detecting new exposures in days, not months. So, like I said earlier, your API team deploys a new API on Monday, it's tested Wednesday, or we can test it before it gets deployed in QA or dev, things to that nature. Compare that to annual testing. You may not discover that API with broken authentication until 6 months from now. Um, we test lateral movement. We automatically test what happens after a compromise. Can an attacker pivot from a compromised web server to your internal network? Can they escalate privileges to reach sensitive systems? Can they exfiltrate data? This post-breach testing is what separates validation from scanning. We're not just finding the entry point. We're mapping the full potential impact of the breach across that network, across those segmentations. You know, um, Coverage, identifying vulnerabilities that scanners miss, logic flaws, configuration chains, zero-day-like behaviors. These are vulnerabilities scanners can't detect. They're not based on a CVE signature. Ridgebot uses AI-driven attack techniques to uncover these exposures. We've discussed critical issues in customer environments that major vulnerabilities had scanned for months without detection, misconfigurations in AWS IAM policies, logic flaws in API authentication, privilege escalation chains via misconfigured service accounts. The list goes on and on. And reducing that time to remediate is, I can't stress that enough either. When you hand a developer or sysadmin a scanner report that says potential vulnerability, they often push back. I have lived this in my own life as a practitioner. I cannot tell you how many times. Prove it. Prove it's an exploit. Prove it's a problem. Prove that I have to spend 10 hours rewriting this code. So is it really exploitable? This creates friction and delays remediation. When you hand them a Ridgebot report with proof of concept exploitation, screenshots, and a step-by-step attack reproduction, that kills the debate. It's exploitable. Here's your proof. They fix it immediately. We've seen customers see reduction in remediation time by 40 to 60%. It kind of kills that, is this real debate? So let me give you some concrete examples of threats Ridgebot catches and traditional scanners miss.
Yep, go ahead, Kevin.
So cloud misconfigurations across AWS. We do have Azure on our roadmap. We have AWS today. And SaaS environments, this is the number one source of breaches today, an S3 bucket with overly permissive IAM policies, a misconfigured Azure AD identity with more privileges than needed, Salesforce integration with excessive API permissions. Scanners don't catch this because they're not CVEs, they're configuration issues. Attackers can exploit them. Ridgebot tests whether these misconfigurations are exploitable. Can we actually access the S3 bucket? Can we abuse the overly privileged identities? Real world example. We found a customer's EC2 instance with an IAM role that had administrative access to their entire AWS environment. It wasn't a vulnerability, it was a misconfiguration, but compromising the one EC2 instance gave us keys to the kingdom in their tenant. With lateral movement paths, can an attacker move east-west after a breach? This is critical ransomware defense. Ransomware doesn't just hit the entry point, it spreads laterally across your network, targeting backup systems, domain controllers, file shares. Ridgebot maps these attack paths. We simulate if an attacker compromises this web server, can they reach the internal database, backup systems, the domain controller? This shows your lateral movement exposure, the blast radius if one system's compromised. With chained vulnerabilities, multiple low severity issues equal critical risk. Here's a real attack we've found. A low severity information disclosure vulnerability exposed in internal network details. A separate medium severity SSH misconfiguration enabled key-based authentication. A third low severity issue was an old forgotten service account with elevated privileges. Chain those three together, you have a path from internet to administrative access inside the environment. Scanners reported 3 separate low to medium level findings. Ridgebot showed the critical chain and was able to show that lateral movement and attack. AI agents and attack surfaces. This is kind of what keeps me up tonight. Now, it used to be other things. Now it's this. New attack surfaces from AI agents and APIs are added daily. This is the 2026 challenge. Organizations are deploying AI agents faster than security can track them or even know about them. Each agent's a new API endpoint, a new set of permissions, a new potential attack vector. Ridgebot discovers these dynamically. We found API chatbot APIs with insufficient proper validation, AI SDR systems with access to CRM data that wasn't properly secured, and AI coding assistants that inadvertently expose source code. These technical findings are important, but we need to tell your board, we need to talk about what your board actually wants to hear.
Absolutely. So obviously we've seen this paradigm shift. The board doesn't want to just hear that we've passed a compliance audit. They want to see that the controls have been validated. 90% of the common attack paths have been validated, and here's the proof.
Right. We passed the compliance audits. That's that checkbox security, the checkbox auditing we're talking about. Your board hears this and thinks, okay, so we're compliant, but are we secure? Are we protected? Are we going to be hit by ransomware? Compliance is backwards thinking. It tells you that you meet requirements at the time of the audit. It doesn't tell you anything about your current security posture or your resilience to real attacks. And I've dealt with this, so this really kind of strikes home. What your board wants to hear is we validated that our controls work. Here's the proof. This is resilience evidence. This is quantified risk. This is what your board members can understand. That's the lives they live. It's not we've implemented controls, but we've validated that our controls work under attack conditions. Not we're compliant, but we've tested our defenses and here's the results. When you walk into a board meeting with Ridgebot validation evidence, your conversation shifts from defensive compliance reporting to proactive risk management. And that's really what we're looking for, is managing that risk. You can walk in and say, we tested 147 attack scenarios this quarter. Our controls prevented 143. Here are the 4 we need to address. Our mean time to detect and critical attack paths decreased from 4.3 to 1.2 hours this quarter. Our defense depth against ransomware scenarios improved from 2 layers to 4 layers after implementing your approved recommendations. That's what your board wants to hear. That's what risk management and the business of risk management is, not IT compliance. So let's look at that business case for continuous validation.
Absolutely. And I think there's 3 key points that you can speak to here, Kevin. Mean time to remediate, breach cost avoidance, and compliance confidence. Those are three of the key areas I'd like you to focus on in this slide.
Right. With, mean time to remediate, automated exploitation proof accelerates remediation prioritization. We discussed, this earlier by eliminating, is this real? And that just wipes that conversation out. When you provide developers and operations teams with proof of concept exploits, they immediately understand the risk. No back and forth, no security theater, no 3 meetings to figure out what we need to fix. We've seen customers reduce mean time to remediation by 40 to 60%. If your current mean time to remediation is 30 days, you can cut it by 12. You're reducing your exposure window by 60%. That directly reduces risk and potential breach cost. With quantified impact, let's put that numbers to it. If you have 100 critical vulnerabilities per quarter, and reducing MTTR by 18 days means each vulnerability is exploitable for 18 fewer days. That's 1,800 fewer vulnerability days of exposure at an average breach cost of $4.5 million. Even a small reduction in breach probability pays for the platform many times over. You know, continuous validation reduces that undetected exposure window. 2024 IBM cost of a data breach report shows that the global average of a data breach is 4.88 million. With the US, it's 9.4 million. The difference between organizations with strong security postures and those with weak ones often comes down to the speed of exposure detection. If continuous validation helps you detect and remediate one critical exposure that led to a breach, you've justified years of investment. We're not talking about preventing just one, we're talking about preventing dozens over time. You know, with compliance confidence, evidence-based risk reporting, not assumption-based. This has a soft ROI that becomes a hard ROI during audits, insurance renewals, incident response. Again, cyber insurance premiums are going through the roof, up 20 to 30% year over year for many organizations. Insurers are asking tougher questions about your security posture, demonstrating continuous validation, evidence-based risk reporting, proven resilience that can help you negotiate better rates and avoid being dropped altogether. Similarly, when auditors ask, how do you know your controls are effective? You have evidence. You don't just have a vulnerability report. This speeds up audits and reduces compliance friction as well. So, really the ROI is clear when you consider breach cost avoidance, efficiency gains, and compliance benefits. Most customers see payback within 6 to 12 months with Ridgebot. So, how do we do this? Let's look at a 2026 roadmap for this.
Absolutely. So this is kind of illustrates how you could operationalize a solution like Ridgebot and have that real world payback. So Kevin, I don't know if you wanted to jump in here on what that would look like.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to start by that baseline exposure, fingerprinting your targets, your web applications, your APIs, looking at what's out there, understanding that current attack surface. What is my attack surface? Let Ridgebot discover and fingerprint your environment, all internet-facing assets, cloud infrastructure, APIs, and web applications. This baseline becomes your exposure inventory. You'll likely discover shadow IT, everybody does, forgotten resources, an attack surface you didn't know existed. We had one client discover 37% more attack surfaces than was reflected in their asset inventory. It happens every day. We give you a complete attack surface map, initial exposure baseline, and after initial testing, that prioritized remediation list. Then we move to Q2, continuous validation of critical attack surfaces, cloud and perimeter, focusing on highest risk areas first. For most organizations, that's internet-facing perimeter and cloud infrastructure, AWS, Azure, GCP. If we enable continuous validation for these critical areas, we set up automated testing cadences, weekly, daily, or continuous, depending on change velocity, and then we start building that evidence base. Continuous validation operational on 60 to 80% of the critical attack surface for first set of validation metrics for your board reporting. Q3, we expand the scope to lateral movement, post-breach scenarios, expand beyond perimeter testing to internal attack paths, lateral movement from DMZ to the internal network, test privilege escalation paths, test post-breach scenarios. If an attacker compromises X, what can they reach? This is where you build, your defense in depth metrics. You can demonstrate that even if the perimeter is breached, attackers still face multiple additional barriers before reaching the crown jewels. Lateral movement maps, defense depth metrics, expanded coverage to 90% of the critical infrastructure in this quarter. So moving on to Q4, we've got board ready metrics. Resiliency scoring, You've accumulated 3/4 worth of validation data. Now you can produce sophisticated reports, trends over time, resilient scores, defense depth metrics, MTTR improvements, before and after comparisons. This becomes your annual board presentation. Here's our resilience posture. Here's our validation. Here's our evidence. It makes it quantified risk at that point in time. Evidence-based recommendation for next year's security budget. And this isn't rip and replace. You keep your existing scanners and tools. Ridgebot augments them with validation capabilities. Most customers are up and running within 2 to 4 weeks with Ridgebot. So, we've talked about 2026 and what that inherent risk looks like. Let's address that AI challenge that's unique to 2026.
Absolutely, Kevin. I don't know if you wanted to speak to these few points here on this slide. Yep.
We talked about it quite a bit earlier, but the challenge this year is AI, the AI explosion. It's just going to quadruple, if not more, this year than it did in the last year or two. Again, that's new identities and agents deployed daily beyond your governance model. Here's what's happening in organizations right now. Sales is deploying AI SDRs. Customer services has their chatbots. Marketing has content generation chatbots. HR has AI recruiting chatbots or assistants. And development now has AI coding copilots. Each of these AI agents represents a new identity with credentials and permissions, a new API endpoint that processes data, a new integration with your systems, and a new potential attack vector. Here's the kicker. Most of these are being deployed outside by business units, not IT. They're SaaS-based, they're outside traditional governance, and they're multiplying faster than security teams can track them. Traditional security tools aren't built for this velocity. Your asset inventory might update monthly, your vulnerability scans might run weekly, but AI agents are being deployed daily or even hourly in some organizations. With Ridgebot, we continuously discover and test new exposures automatically. We don't rely on manual asset inventory updates. Ridgebot continually discovers APIs, new endpoints, new services as they appear. The AI chatbot API your customer service team deployed yesterday, Ridgebot finds it and tests it today. So, with the infrastructure velocity, we keep pace with infrastructure. Your security team can't manually track. Your security team is 10 to 15 people, can't manually test hundreds of new services every week. Ridgebot can. It scales to match your infrastructure velocity and helps you keep ahead of this threat. Surfaces risks before they become incidents. We've found AI agent APIs with insufficient authentication, AI systems with access to customer data they shouldn't have, AI services with insecure configurations. The key is catching these before the attackers do, not in 6 months when you have your biannual pen test, because the attackers are absolutely targeting AI agents. They're new, they're often immature, and from a security perspective, and they have access to valuable data. Really, the reality is this year, if you're not continuously discovering and validating your data and that your AI attack surface, you're flying blind on the fastest growing part of your exposure. Let me bring this all together and kind of what this really all means.
Absolutely. So the 2027 shift, shift your imperative. Kevin, I don't know if you wanted to speak to these few points, and I know we're running up against the time here, so
yeah,
we promise we'll get into the product very shortly here.
Yeah, it's just point blank. Visibility is necessary, but it's not sufficient. Scanners find what exists. Validation proves you can defend it. You still need your vulnerability scanners, your asset inventory, your compliance tools. The visibility layer is foundational, but it's not the end goal. The end goal's resilience, knowing not just what vulnerabilities exist, but whether your defenses can withstand real attacks. That requires validation. Think of it like building construction. The blueprints are our visibility. It shows you what the building looks like. Structural testing is our validation. It proves the building won't collapse under load. Both are necessary. One without the other is insufficient. Your board, your auditors, and attackers won't wait for next year's pen test. This is a tempo shift. The days of annual security assessments are over, not because annual pen tests are bad. They're still valuable for deep dive analysis, but they're not sufficient for continuous risk management. Your board wants quarterly risk updates. Your auditors want evidence of continuous monitoring. Your insurance company wants proof of ongoing validation. And attackers certainly aren't waiting until your next annual pen test to strike. Continuous validation matches the cadence of modern business and modern threats. Resilience equals evidence. Replace compliance theater with proof that controls work under attack. This is a cultural shift, moving from we implemented security controls to we validated that our security controls work. Compliance theater says we have a firewall, EDR, and a WAF. Check the boxes. Back to that checkbox security. Evidence-based resilience says we tested our firewall under attack conditions. Here's what it blocked and what it missed. We simulated lateral movement. Our EDR detected it and contained it within 17 minutes. We tested our WAF. It blocked 94% of OWASP top 10 attacks. One is about having things. The other is about proving that things work. The shift really isn't optional anymore. It's becoming table stakes for mature security programs, board expectations, insurance requirements, and what really customers trust. So, where do we go from here?
Yep, and I promise that this is the last slide here before maybe, Kevin, you could flash the RidgeBot platform and show how this would work in an operationalized environment.
Yeah, so, we covered a lot today. Let's talk about some actionable steps. If you want to start moving forward towards continuous validation, where are you today? Are you primarily in visibility mode with scanners and annual pen tests? Do you have evidence that your controls work, or are you relying on assumptions? Do you know your exposure in near real time, or do you have blind spots? Be honest about where you are. There's no shame, pulling back the covers and seeing what's there. If you're visibility focused, that's where most organizations are, but acknowledge it, obviously is the first step towards shift. You don't need to validate everything on day one. Start with what matters most. Internet-facing applications, cloud infrastructure, AWS, Azure, GCP, critical APIs, systems that process customer data. Prioritize based on business impact and likelihood of attack. What would attackers target? What would cause the most damage if compromised? Start with a pilot. Choose a critical application or environment, perhaps cloud, your main web application. Run RidgeBot against it for 30 days. See what you discover. Compare the findings with what your scanners report. Most customers are fairly surprised at what validation uncovers that scanning missed. And that proof of value becomes business case for expansion. With the ROI framework that we talked about, mean time to reduction, breach cost, avoidance, and compliance competence, quantify the value, show the pilot results, connect it to board priorities, quantified risk, resilience evidence, and business continuity. We'd love to help you build your 2026 continuous validation strategy. Reach out to us. We'd like to show you the product in depth.